There are stories that arrive quietly, like a whisper at the edge of a long day. Stories that don't need special effects or miracles to matter. They simply reveal the moments when God steps into an ordinary life at the exact time a heart begins to break. Today I want to share one of those stories with you, a story about a woman who thought God had forgotten her, until she discovered he had been closer than she imagined. She didn't ask for a miracle that night. She didn't even have the strength to hope for one. All she wanted was air, just enough air to breathe past the knot in her chest. The world had been heavy for months, maybe years, and somewhere along the way, she stopped expecting God to show up for her the way he used to. Life had a way of numbing her faith, one unpaid bill, one broken promise, one lonely night at a time. When she pushed her apartment door open, nothing felt different. The hallway light flickered like always, the grocery bag cut into her fingers, and the silence inside greeted her the same way it always did, like an empty room waiting for someone who never came home. She wasn't angry. She was just tired. Tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. Tired in a way that prayer no longer seemed to reach. She dropped the bag on the counter and stared at the receipts. Numbers blurred. Deadlines pressed. Somewhere deep inside, a question she had avoided began whispering louder. God, where are you now? She turned on the stove, more out of habit than hunger, and while the water warmed, she felt something inside her unravel. The kind of unraveling that happens when a person has held everything together for far too long. Her hands trembled, her breath hitched, and for the first time in months, she whispered a prayer, not beautiful, not eloquent, not even confident, just raw, small, human. Lord, I don't know what to do anymore. She wasn't expecting an answer. She wasn't even sure the words had reached him. But something in the room shifted, quietly, subtly, almost imperceptibly. Not a miracle, not a sign, just a stillness, a softness. A gentle hush in the atmosphere that didn't make sense for a kitchen filled with unpaid bills and boiling water. And as she stood there, alone under the dim kitchen light, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Something she couldn't fully explain. A presence that didn't speak, didn't flash, didn't prove anything. It simply stayed, with her. In the silence, in the heaviness, in the place where she believed God had abandoned her. She didn't know it yet. But this was the night everything would begin to change, not with thunder, not with a miracle, but with a whisper from heaven that sounded a lot like hope returning home. Her days all looked the same lately, a quiet loop she walked through without thinking. Wake up before the sun, rush through a half-eaten breakfast, survive another long shift at work, come home to an apartment that felt more like a storage room for her exhaustion than a place of rest. She moved through life with the careful steps of someone who didn't want to break anything, especially herself. Most people around her didn't know much about her life. At work she smiled when she had to, kept her head down, did what was expected. She wasn't the type to complain or ask for help. She believed in handling things alone, in being the strong one, even when strength felt like a thin thread stretched too far. Her finances had been tight for a long time, but things had gotten worse after a few unexpected emergencies. A car repair, a medical bill, rent going up yet again. She tried budgeting, cutting corners, working extra hours. Nothing seemed to be enough. Every month felt like trying to outrun a wave that kept rising behind her, and through all of this, her faith, once steady and warm, had become something she wasn't sure how to hold anymore. She still believed in God. She never doubted that. She just didn't feel him, didn't hear him, didn't sense anything but silence, and silence, when life is falling apart, can feel heavier than the collapse itself. Yet even in her drifting faith, she carried memories she couldn't ignore. Moments from years ago when she felt God so clearly it made her breath catch. A retreat where she cried for the first time in months. A Sunday morning that felt like sunlight finally cracking open a dark room. Prayers answered so precisely that she knew someone was listening. Those memories were the only reason she hadn't given up. Not on life, not on God, not on the idea that maybe things could get better. She just didn't know how, she didn't know when. She didn't know if she still deserved his attention after drifting so far. So she kept going, one heavy step after another, carrying her heart like a fragile box she didn't have time to repair. Even the people closest to her didn't see it. Friends thought she was busy. Family thought she was strong. No one saw the truth. She was tired in her bones. Tired of being resilient. Tired of holding it all together. Tired of pretending the silence didn't hurt. But that night, without her knowing, would become the turning point. The moment where the weight she carried would finally be met by a presence she thought she had lost forever. That night, the apartment felt colder than usual. Maybe it was the weather, or maybe it was the kind of cold that comes from carrying too much for too long. She set her keys on the counter and let her coat slip from her shoulders, landing in a soft heap on the floor. She didn't bother picking it up. Not tonight. Tonight, even the smallest task felt like a mountain. She opened the grocery bag and placed the few items she managed to buy onto the counter. A box of pasta, a small jar of sauce, a loaf of discounted bread. Nothing special, nothing comforting, just enough to get through another week. She stared at the items for a long moment, feeling something inside her chest twist in a way she couldn't ignore anymore. Her phone buzzed with a notification. She didn't look. She knew what waited there. Another payment reminder, another warning, another message she didn't have the emotional room to face. She turned the phone face down. For once, she just wanted quiet. Real quiet. Not the kind that suffocates, but the kind that lets you breathe. But the silence she got was the wrong kind. The heavy kind. The kind that presses against your ribcage until your breath turns shallow. She walked to the small kitchen table and pulled out the stack of bills she'd been avoiding. She spread them out like a deck of bad cards, each one a reminder of how fragile her life had become. She traced her fingers over the numbers, the due dates, the threats in fine print. Her throat tightened, her eyes burned. She blinked hard, trying to steady herself, but the tears came anyway, slowly at first, then faster. They blurred the ink on the page as her shoulders trembled under the weight she never let anyone see. She covered her face with both hands and pressed her palms against her eyes, as if she could hold herself together by sheer force, but she couldn't, not tonight. Tonight, the walls she had built so carefully finally cracked, and for the first time in a very long time, she let herself break. A small sob escaped her, then another, the kind you try to swallow but can't, the kind that comes from a place deeper than sadness, a place where disappointment, fear, loneliness, and exhaustion all gather at once. She whispered into the quiet, barely audible, "God, I can't do this anymore." Her voice wasn't angry. It wasn't dramatic. It was the sound of a soul that had reached the end of its strength, a plea more than a prayer, a confession more than a request. She leaned forward, elbows on the table, head resting in her hands. The bills lay scattered in front of her like pieces of a life she no longer knew how to manage, and for a long moment, nothing moved, not the air, not her thoughts, not even her hope. It was in that stillness, raw, painful, unfiltered, that something in the atmosphere began to shift. She didn't notice it yet, but heaven had already started moving toward her. The kettle clicked off behind her, a soft sound that echoed through the apartment like a reminder that time was still moving, even if she felt stuck in place. Steam drifted into the air, curling upward in delicate ribbons. She didn't move. She couldn't. Her tears slowed, but the weight in her chest remained heavy and unmoving. She wiped her face with the sleeve of her sweater and took one long, trembling breath. The kind of breath a person takes when they have nothing left to hold on to, but the hope that maybe, just maybe, they're not as alone as they feel. She stood from the table, her legs unsteady, and walked back toward the stove. The overhead light flickered slightly like it always did, but something felt different in the room. Not a change in temperature, not a sound, not a sign, just a softness, a gentleness in the atmosphere that hadn't been there before. It felt like walking into a room where someone had just been, someone safe, someone familiar, yet no one was there. She rested her hands on the counter and closed her eyes. For a moment, her mind fell completely still. No fear, no calculations, no noise, only a quiet that felt strangely full, as if the silence itself had shifted its shape. She didn't hear a voice. She didn't see a vision. But deep inside, below the ache and the worry, something warm began to rise. A presence that wrapped around the edges of her heart, like a soft blanket being pulled over tired shoulders. Her breath loosened, her shoulders lowered, her heartbeat steadied. She opened her eyes slowly, expecting the heaviness to return, but it didn't. The bills were still on the table. The problems were still real, yet something in her spirit settled, a peace that didn't make sense, not with everything falling apart, not with her life in chaos. She placed a hand over her chest, surprised by the stillness she felt there. It wasn't relief, not yet, but it was something like being held. For the first time in months, she whispered a prayer that didn't feel forced. "Are you here?" The words slipped out quietly, almost unconsciously, as if her soul had spoken them before her mouth did. And although the room stayed silent, she felt an answer, not in her ears, but in the small, steady warmth returning to her chest. A warmth that reminded her of mornings long ago, when faith came easily and she believed, truly believed, that God cared about her life. Tears filled her eyes again, but these were different, softer, not breaking tears, but healing ones. Because in that quiet kitchen, surrounded by all the things she couldn't fix, she felt it. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. Not tonight. Not ever. She didn't sleep much that night, but for the first time in a long time, the sleeplessness didn't feel like a battle. She drifted in and out, wrapped in a strange calm she couldn't explain. When the sun finally climbed through the cracks of her blinds, she felt something unusual, an impulse to get out of bed instead of hiding beneath the covers. Her room was still the same. The bills were still waiting in the kitchen. Life hadn't magically rearranged itself overnight, but the heaviness in her chest was lighter, not gone, just eased, as if someone had lifted the burden enough for her to take a full breath. She sat on the edge of her bed, rubbing her eyes, letting the morning settle around her. For months, mornings had been the hardest part of her day, but today, something inside whispered, "Start with small steps." So she did. She walked to the kitchen, half expecting the peace to disappear the moment she saw the pile of overdue envelopes. But strangely, it didn't. The problems hadn't changed, but her heart had found a quieter rhythm. She made coffee and sat down, her hands wrapped around the warm mug. For a brief moment she prayed again, softly, hesitantly. "Lord, help me today." She didn't expect anything to happen. It was just a whisper into the morning air. But as she took a sip of coffee, her phone buzzed. Normally she would have ignored it, but something nudged her to look. It was an email. At first she thought it was another bill, but when she opened it, she froze. It was from her supervisor, someone who rarely emailed her directly. They were offering her a few extra hours for the upcoming week, just enough to cover what she'd been short on. Not a miracle, not a solution to everything, but exactly the piece she needed. She stared at the screen, stunned. The timing felt too perfect to be coincidence. She set the phone down, her eyes filling with that same soft warmth from the night before. Before the tears could fall, another notification popped up. A message from a friend she hadn't spoken to in months. "Hey, you've been on my mind, are you okay? I don't know why, but I felt like I needed to check on you this morning." She covered her mouth with her hand, her breath catching in her throat. It was too much, too precise, too gentle, too intentional. Then, as if the universe wanted to make sure she didn't miss the meaning, another thing happened. While scrolling absent-mindedly, she came across a short video from a pastor she followed years ago. And the message? The exact words she had whispered the night before. "You're not alone. God has not forgotten you. He hears the prayers you don't know how to pray." She felt a shiver run through her. This wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a parting of the sea. It wasn't an angel in the living room. It was something far greater. A God who meets his children in the details, in timing, in nudges, in the quiet threads that pull us back toward hope. She sat there at the small kitchen table, hands trembling around her mug, and whispered through new tears, "Thank you. I see you." For the first time in a long time, she meant it. For a long moment, she simply sat there, letting the truth settle in her chest like warm light spreading through a dark room. Nothing about her circumstances had magically changed. The bills still waited on the table. The pressures of life were still real, still heavy, but something inside her had shifted in a way she couldn't deny. It wasn't hope built on wishful thinking. It wasn't optimism pretending things were easy. It was deeper than that, steadier, quieter, a sense that God had stepped into the spaces she thought he had abandoned, not with thunder or visions, but with the kind of presence that moves gently, almost imperceptibly, until you suddenly realize you're not carrying everything alone anymore. She leaned back in her chair, closed her eyes and let herself breathe, really breathe. And as she did, she understood something she hadn't been able to see in months. God had never been silent. She had simply been too overwhelmed to hear him. His voice had been in the small mercies, the unexpected timing, the unexplainable peace, the people who reached out without knowing why. He had been in the details, in the stillness, in the soft nudge that brought her to tears the night before, in the morning light that fell gently across her kitchen table now. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel forgotten. She felt held. She picked up one of the bills, her fingers steady. For months, this paper had felt like a threat, a reminder of everything collapsing. But now it just felt like something she could face, one step at a time, one day at a time, with a God who wasn't distant after all. She wasn't suddenly brave. She wasn't suddenly strong. She was simply not alone. And that made all the difference. Before starting her day, she whispered one last prayer, not desperate, not broken, just honest. Stay with me. And though the room stayed quiet, she felt the answer deep within her spirit, the same gentle presence that met her in the dark, that found her even when she couldn't find him. I never left. She smiled through fresh tears, warmed by a truth she had almost forgotten. A truth the morning had made unmistakably clear. Even in the silence, God is speaking. Even in the struggle, he is near. And even in the smallest moments, especially in those, he is already working. Maybe you've had nights like hers, nights when the weight of life pressed so hard on your chest that even breathing felt like a battle. Nights when you wondered if God had stepped away, or if he had grown tired of waiting for you to get it together. Nights so silent that you questioned whether your prayers still mattered at all. If that's where you are right now, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not forgotten. You are not unseen. And you are not carrying all of this by yourself. Sometimes God moves in ways we don't recognize at first. Sometimes his voice sounds less like thunder and more like a quiet reminder to stand up again. Sometimes his help comes through timing, through people, through whispers of peace that have no logical explanation. And sometimes the miracle isn't the problem disappearing, it's the strength you feel rising when you expected to collapse. The story you heard today isn't just about one woman. It's about a God who sees every heart that feels tired, every soul that feels alone, every person who has whispered, I can't do this anymore. And maybe this story found you because you needed to remember that he is closer than you think, closer than your fear, closer than your doubt, closer than the silence that has been echoing inside you. If tonight feels heavy, let this be your reminder. He is still here, he is still listening, and he is already moving in ways you can't see yet. Thank you for spending this time with me. And if this story touched something in your heart, stay close. There are more stories to tell, more reminders that hope still breathes, more moments where heaven meets ordinary life. You're not walking this journey alone, not tonight, not tomorrow, not ever.